Okay, my name is Sarah. I'm the program manager for the Growing Indigenous Storytellers Fellowship at Journalists for Human Rights. Thank you guys so much for joining the call. We really appreciate it. I want to thank our lovely partners in this program. So it's the Indigenous Journalists Association and APTN News. We're coming to the end of the program here at the end of December, and it's just been so great working with them, and I really hope that we can do it again. Just off the top, we'll do just a bit of housekeeping. So we're going to do 25 to 30 minutes of presentation, then about 10 minutes of Q&A. This meeting is being recorded and will be posted to YouTube, including the Q&A portion, so please keep that in mind. Please feel free to drop your questions in the chat as we go. Kaila might be able to address them as we're going, and if not, I can read them out at the end. And without further ado, I will introduce Kaila. So Kaila Johnston is the Director of Education at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, where she oversees support for educators, developing resources, outreach initiatives, and public engagement on residential schools and their legacy. Prior to joining the NCTR, she worked with the TRC to support statement gathering activities, and Kaila holds an honors bachelor's degree in criminal justice and a master's in international crimes and criminology.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Sarah. And I'm going to get things started with my lovely bright orange presentation. I am just going to make sure that I do have, say, that chat function open for any questions coming in. But then I'm going to dive right into things by actually providing a little bit more information about myself. But I'm hoping everyone can see our engaging reconciliation in the news, beautiful orange background there. So, as shared in my introduction, I worked for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And actually, yeah, I'll jump for that first and then I'll go back to my slide of the 4 schools there. So I first started with the TRC in 2010. I was one of the first 25 statement gatherers trained through the program. And something I'd like to mark is that not all 25 of us made it through the commission. In fact, only 2 of us made it through the full commission. Myself and one other, name's Barb Cameron. She's one of our Survivor Circle members now and provides guidance to our center. So the group photo up on screen is of our statement gatherers, senior archivists, statement gathering personnel. To my left is our current executive director, Stephanie Scott, and to the furthest left is our former director, Rai Moran, both of which oversaw statement gathering activities at the TRC. So this is a group photo of all of us at the closing ceremonies in Ottawa in June of 2015 when they released the calls to action. So I did get to travel across the country to listen to survivors, families, communities about their experience in the residential school system and its impact. But in addition to that, I'm an intergenerational survivor. So my mother attended residential school, as did her parents, siblings, grandparents, and extended family. So the collage of the schools are of the ones that impacted my family. 3 are in the Qu'Appelle Valley in Saskatchewan, Maryvale, Round Lake, and Qu'Appelle, and one's located in Alberta known as Crowfoot. So growing up, I also did hear some of the stories and experiences my mother shared with me, and some of those also, the generational stories that were shared to her and then shared to me. Now, before we jump into the presentation, I have a couple of quick warnings. One, difficult content warning. So hearing about traumatic experiences is inherently traumatic. And so by simply listening to, seeing, hearing, reading the presentation content, there's that potential for triggering as well as harm. And so I want you to really think about some forms of self-care and to look after yourself after today's session. And that's one of the biggest pieces for me. I will share, I'm an escapist. So after difficult sessions, I like to watch films or listen to, uplifting music, anything that can raise my spirits. Now, the second one I will offer here is through some parts of the presentation, you will see outdated and offensive terminology. Sometimes in the records, we come across these words which are no longer used today and are derogatory, are offensive, and harmful. There will be instances where I'll be using that language specific to records and content. Outside of that, however, I will be using Indigenous, First Nations, Métis, Inuit, or community-specific place names. But why I keep this in and don't change it is language frames the way in which we think about and know the world. And understanding how the governments, institutions, other agencies perceived and understood Indigenous peoples at the time of the creation of those documents helps us understand situations today. It also allows us to let's see, that's a good question. I think I'm going to toggle subtitles and see what that does.
I'm just impressed that you can do this on the fly.
You know what? Give me half a second. I think I have to stop sharing.
Okay.
And I have an option to set this up with subtitles. I just have to select the language. So subtitle settings, below the slide, checking for subtitles.
Is it working for
Checking
you?
for subtitles.
I don't see them yet.
There we are.
Perfect.
I will share once more, put this up on screen, and I'm just going to pull the chat box down. There we are.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Kaila.
Of course. So by calling out the use of offensive and antiquated language, we hope to encourage others to really think about how Indigenous people were referred to and known at the creation of those documents, but how they're known today and how we engage and reference Indigenous peoples in the news today. And so while I won't be going into a deep dive into what is the residential school system, there are a few pieces I wanted to share. One of them being this quote by a man that you see up on screen. We're looking at Duncan Campbell Scott. He was the Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs and oversaw the residential school system. And most often, a quote is used to refer to this system as having been created to kill the Indian in the child. I don't actually like that quote because it's a misquote. It comes from the United States context, but it is very powerful and evocative. It really gets to the core idea behind the creation of these systems. But I like to use this quote instead to refer to the Canadian context, where Duncan Campbell Scott said, "I want to get rid of the Indian problem. Our object is to continue until there's not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question and no Indian department." And we can see very clearly from this quote what the aim and purpose was when it came to the residential school system, the federal day school system, the segregated healthcare system that we had here in Canada, which were all created to eliminate Indigenous peoples as a unique, distinct group. Now, there is often an emphasis that the perpetrators of this system were the Canadian government as well as Christian churches like the Catholic Church and the United Church. And when you look at the settlement agreement, that's the primary focus of the class action lawsuit was against those two institutions. But it would be remiss of me to say they were the only perpetrators or individuals involved. Most of the focus on the perpetrators has created a belief that in history it's only isolated to those two institutions, when in reality these residential schools and other colonial systems operated within a wide range of economic, political, and social systems. So for instance, organizations like the YWCA, the Young Women's Association of Canada, worked with former residential school students following their release from residential schools. They did so to continue the assimilation effect for Indigenous children, in this case for young Indigenous girls, to adopt the European Canadian mannerisms and evolve and move into that society, ensuring that they don't return back to their home communities. And so there are a number of philanthropic-based organizations whose aims and goals was to assist communities, assist individuals. But unfortunately, from their perspective and view, the way to best achieve that assistance was through assimilation and, again, that erasure of Indigenous identity. And so one thing I wanted to share, given that the group that I have here today is connected to news, is I wanted to show you some news articles connected to residential schools prior to, you know, the push from survivors in the late 80s in seeking compensation and addressing the, common experiences survivors had. Because prior to that time in the 1980s with survivors coming forward, this is what you're going to see in the media. And I have several examples, but a lot of it is positive press pieces. So in this case, this is a collage of articles about hockey. And so the first one there is Birtle hockey teams. 2 hockey teams from the Birtle Residential School visited Fox Warren, where they won 7-2 and 9-2. The one right beside it says Portage team wins Batnam Puck tournament. The Portage La Prairie Residential School captured top honors in a Bantam BB hockey tournament. They trounced Minnedosa 7-1 after beating Brookdale by the same score and blanking McCreary 7-0. Next one, the last one. The Brandon Indian Residential School captures tourney, represents Brandon on the 28th. So what you'll find is that there really is no articles that touch upon abuses or harms happening in residential school. It's about their sports teams. It's about their band. So this one is from the Vancouver Sun about the St. Mary's Mission. It says, Indian boys to show skills at sports and exhibit. Smartly accoutred and fully equipped and trained, the Mission Indian School Band will, with other Indian bands, be one of the big attractions at the Indian Sasquatch Days, Harrison Hot Springs. There's another one which is also connected to BC. This is the province, and it's about the St. George Lytton Residential School. It says, BC Indian lad on Bisley team. Expert marksman Clifford Bolton, whose first targets were rabbits and bears, has won a place on the Canadian team going to Bisley. Here he is polishing his marksmanship over the past 3 years as a member of the St. George Indian Residential School Cadet Corps at Lytton. Above here, we see him showing his brother the finer points of shooting. He's also a collector of jade. Cliff is able to put a high polish on jewelry he makes, while he only has 2 fingers on his left hand. And so these are news articles spanning from the 1930s. This one is 1959. Kind of the last ones I'll show come from the 1960s. So this one says, Caribou Girls Band is a hit. When the show commemorating Canada's 98th birthday went on stage at Parliament Hill, the program went on without a hitch. Most of those watching didn't know about or appreciate the amount of work that went into planning. The Caribou Indian Girls Pipe Band from Williams Lake, BC put on a full year's of preparation into last night's performance. So you see, it's a lot of news that focuses on how well the residential schools are providing for these children there. So the types of extracurricular activities that they're excelling in, anything that's going to bring that positive attention to the school, to the church, to the government running these institutions. Now, what you aren't hearing about is the harms and abuses. And what you aren't hearing about is things like deaths at residential school. So for instance, although we don't have a formalized stat today, this is probably the close we will get right now. So you had a higher chance of dying in a residential school, 1 in 25 odds, versus a soldier fighting in World War II, which was 1 in 26. And this is based on 150,000 children having attended and approximately 6,000 children having died. But if you begin to dig into some of the research or the news articles that are being released right now, you're going to find a whole range of numbers as to how many children have passed away. Presently, our research has identified 4,879 children, which is a combination of named and unnamed lists. After the close of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, research continued on the records that were given to the NCTR, but we are still waiting on records to come from the federal government in some institutions today. So we do expect this number will continue to rise as research is ongoing. The same can be said about the question of how many children across Canada attended. Right now, we say it's 150,000, but we do expect that number will also rise with ongoing research. And so some of the things that I wanted to share here was a little bit about our center itself and accessing the records that we utilize for education purposes, for research purposes. So very broadly, we come out of the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement, also known as the IRSA Agreement or the Settlement Agreement. Negotiations for this agreement were approved in 2006 as a single large class action lawsuit was seen as a more beneficial means of addressing all of the outstanding litigation up until 2005. At that time, it was estimated there were between 18 and 20,000 individual lawsuits coming forward. And if all survivors were alive, alive at that time, were to take that route, you're looking at 80,000 single lawsuits, which would have bankrupted the country, put a complete freeze on our court system. So this agreement states harms and abuses were committed against many children who attended residential school, and this agreement was formed to create a fair, comprehensive, and lasting resolution, as well as promoting healing, education, commemoration, truth, and reconciliation. I wanted to share that the TRC received $60 million for 5 years. They got a 1-year extension because of a false start, but they had the responsibility to tell Canadians what happened in residential schools, honor the lives of former students and their families, and create that lasting permanent legacy of the history of the residential school system. And part and parcel of this work was once the TRC closed its doors and concluded its work, we opened ours. So here at the NCTR, we are the permanent safe home for all the materials gathered by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. So we work with a network of partners and supporters to continue to expand this collection and promote ongoing research and learning. We're here for survivors and families to provide access to their records. We're here for educators and students to bring this history into the classroom. We're here for researchers to dive deeper into the mysteries that exist. We're also here to ensure we can help foster healing and reconciliation by providing access to this content and ensure that this history is never forgotten or repeated. Now, just to put into perspective how many requests we receive, since 2017, we've received over 2,300 survivor-specific requests. And our requests can have multiple people. One of the largest files is of 14 siblings. And since 2021, we've received over 4,900 requests. That includes survivor requests, researcher requests, media requests, general requests. And so when it comes to what do we have in our collection, we have over 3.5 million items and growing. We have materials from 17 different government departments, including health and justice, and 132 church entities. So that's larger organizations like the United Church. But of course, when it comes to the Catholic Church, there are many different repositories or archives that make up that organization. Now, what's so unique about our center, and I'm so excited to share, is that we have an online database where you can get access to over 71,000 items right now. Order over 42,000 text documents, over 27,000 photographs, both historical and contemporary, and over 1,300 videos. So very broadly, I wanted to show this is what that archive page looks like when you first arrive. It's archives.nctr.ca. And yes, the function is working, so I put the direct link into the chat. And this is the main page that you'll land on, so you can do research by school, by event, record types, subject types, places. I often do recommend organizations first start by schools to take a look, is there a school specific to your region that you're interested in doing research? And so this is what one of that main landing pages look like if I hit the school button. And then I can go by region and then get very more specific and pick a residential school. So for instance, here is the landing page for the Maryvale Residential School in Saskatchewan. You can see at the time of this photo, we had about 123 publicly accessible records. If I scroll down just a little bit, you'll notice on the left-hand side it says Maryvale Residential School Narrative. I highly recommend accessing that document. It is the preliminary research done by the federal government to determine whether or not the school is to be added to a recognized school list. It has about 10 to 13 pages of information, which then, in a larger document that it is, will reference. So there are about 500 or so pages of materials referenced in that document. So I do encourage, if you have that chance, to take a look at that document. But as I said, you can search by subject type, and here's some of the most useful search terms that I've used. Quarterly returns are a list of students in a residential school for a quarter. You'll never know what you'll find in general administration records. It's a catch-all. But you can also search for death or death of pupil, for vocational and training, medical supplies and accounts, buildings and maintenance, lands, maps, blueprints, yearbooks, newsletters, photographs, letters, memos, reports, you name it. These are just some of the most easily accessible items on that website. Now, I am cognizant of time, and so I did want to show maybe one or two examples. And so I only use publicly accessible materials from our archive. And what I wanted to show you is maybe one or two samples of an incident that occurred at the Cross Lake Residential School here in Manitoba that happened in 1930 to 1932. So I'll give you a very broad, overarching piece. So this is what that residential school looked like. It opened in 1912. It was operated by the Roman Catholic Church. Later, it was operated by the Indian and Eskimo Welfare Commission from 1962 to 1969 before it closed its doors. Now, what had occurred is in 1930, it first starts off with a telegram that says the Cross Lake Residential School was gutted by fire. It says there were 5 little girls and the Sister Superior who had perished. There are 3 nuns who were injured, and everything in the building was lost. In fact, we then get a very interesting flourished account as to what happened at this fire from the Winnipeg Free Press. So these are snippets of it. And so one example I'll share here is Sister Jean de Chantal, a woman of 45, battled on the brink of the 3rd story until she was thrown off by flames to suffer a broken back, lying in snow-swept hinterland in the night clothing until succor came. And so it's very floral language here. And what I can share is the accounts of the students who were there present do not match the accounts that we see in the newspaper about the nuns and the priests fighting valiantly to put out the fire and rescue those children. In reality, all of the nuns were stuck on the second floor and were forced to jump out of a window because they couldn't reach the doors. The Sister Superior that you do see pictured, Reverend Sister Margaret Mary, she did perish in her attempt to go and rescue those children. But although they give a very, again, florid account of this rescue, realistically, what had happened is she had passed away in the stairwell without actually reaching those children. So there was an investigation done to see what had caused the fire, and what they determined in the end was that it was arson, that someone set fire to the residential school. So over the next 2 years, they do a manhunt, so to speak, and they do find the two students who had set the fire. So, Gren, here is a newspaper article from that time talking about the young boys who had set the fire. And the information that they have that you see is incorrect in many different places. So they refer to them, for instance, George Painter, 22-year-old half-breed. He was 16 and he was treaty status. It also talks of an exaggerated account as to the RCMP officer, Sergeant Saul, who since the night of the Holocaust worked on the case incessantly for 19 months in order to capture these individuals. And in the end here, there's a completely fabricated an account here. It says it was during the early morning hours that the flames swept through the three-story structure. Only the heroism of the Sister Superior kept the death toll down to 10. She perished with her proteges as she was leading a group of Indian pupils, all under the age of 9, along the corridor of this institution. Completely false. Now, in the end, unfortunately, this story ends poorly for these young men, or I should say young boys. I was able to connect with Library and Archives Canada to be able to pull these photos because they were tried. George Painter, as you can see, he was 17 when he went into the institution, and he decided to go by a trial by judge rather than jury, which is a poor choice because it was the harshest sentence that judge had ever made, which was life imprisonment for George Painter. Well, Nelson Hughes, who was the older young man, as you can see, he was married actually when they did eventually find him. Both boys said the other boy did it. So it was a he said situation. Although I will share, there is a very interesting impassioned letter for one of the boys' lawyers who outlines a few things. It says, from the evidence disclosed, every boy in that school had a hatred of the officials in charge. Such a condition is not right, nor is it moral in an Indian school. It says, I submit that the officers in charge of the school had failed in their duty with the result that these young boys must suffer the consequences. And so both did serve time in prison. And while George passed away in prison in 1947, his, I suppose, co-conspirator, the young boy along with him, Nelson Hughes, he was released afterwards. He decided to go by a trial by jury, and that actually was seen in his favor. But as I showed, a lot of the newspaper articles here are very inflammatory in their language and how they refer to those young men. Now, that's some of the challenges when it comes to taking a look at some of that history and materials that we find in newspapers, but also what you're going to find in our archive. All that I've just showed here, including these newspaper snippings, are from our archive. And I see that I'm 2 minutes over for the 30-minute based piece.
That's all good. Take your time. We're good.
What I kind of wanted to share here and kind of connect it to, all right, reconciliation in the news. How can we address this? I will share that when it comes to the calls to action very broadly, depending on where you go to get your information, you're going to get a different number as to how many have been addressed to date. I do use Indigenous Watchdog. I highly recommend working with Indigenous Watchdog because they update so frequently. Now, or I should say, there are kind of five major barriers that the Yellowhead Institute have shared when it comes to making progress on reconciliation. We struggle with paternalism, a deep-rooted belief that policymakers and politicians know best compared to Indigenous peoples who could bring their own solutions forward but are prevented from doing so. Structural anti-Indigenous discrimination, the assertion of legal myths like the doctrine of discovery to justify the dispossession of Indigenous peoples from Indigenous lands. Now, this is one I think that really strikes at the media piece, public interest. So policymakers, legal teams have used the disinterest or ignorance of non-Indigenous Canadians to show up in action. And in fact, one of the individuals who really pushes for advocacy for First Nations children, Cindy Blackstock. I'm going to misquote her, but if you do a search, she'll say, when the headlines die, so do the children. So when we stop reporting on, for instance, the focus on child welfare and the number of children dying in foster care or out-of-home placements, the action goes away. So when we don't report it, it goes quiet. And so if there's the lack of the ability to report on this, or we're more or less shoring up the interest of, if we don't report it, then no one has to know and we don't have to do anything. Now, the last two, insufficient resources. We get no shortage of promises, but we have rampant funding inequalities, which means reconciliation is often out of reach. And lastly here, reconciliation has been used in exploitation or for performance. That is, we have institutions, organizations who say one thing, but demonstrate something else. So we hear very real criticisms that reconciliation is dead when we have government offices saying, we're entering this new era of reconciliation, building good relationships with Indigenous peoples, but then sending RCMP to dismantle Unistoten and Wet'suwet'en land-based camps in British Columbia, for instance. Or if we take a look at the Atlantic coast and we see the inaction that exists for the Mi'kmaq fishers who are being very severely targeted as to the interpretation of what it means to make a living when it comes to fishing. And so some of the biggest challenges is there's a lack of transparency, which makes it difficult, if not impossible, to take claims of progress seriously. And so what has been called upon is for government agencies and groups to be able to better report on child welfare gaps to address call to action number 2, educational gaps, which is call to action number 9, healthcare gaps, which is 19, and then overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples, which is call to action 30. The reality is, because of all the different regions in Canada, which are collecting different types of information at different times, it's not a unified front. We're not necessarily collecting the information needed in order to address the very serious concerns brought up through the structural changes needed. Now I'm jumping around just a little bit because I did want to share with the calls to action that there are 3 very specific to media and reconciliation. So there is restore and increase funding for CBC to support reconciliation, number 84. Number 85 is that the Aboriginal Peoples Television Network is to continue to support reconciliation as an independent nonprofit broadcaster. And so there are a couple components connected to that. But then lastly, number 86, journalism and media schools are to offer educational programs in Indigenous history, the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and other issues. And so I did, and I'm very excited to share that in 2024, CBC Radio Canada staff and partners launched Strengthening Relations, We're Walking Together. And so this is the first Indigenous strategy, and it provides direction under kind of these 4 major pillars: relationships, truth and reconciliation, people, and narratives. And I did want to highlight under that specifically um, that there is now tracking when it comes to addressing these calls to action. So you can look outside of Indigenous Watchdog, access this report and see how CBC has been doing to address these 4 pillars. There are, I believe, 14 strategic outcomes connected to this. And one of that was connected to call to action number 84. So, I'm just having a hard time scrolling. No. So when it comes to actions, increasing Aboriginal programming, increasing Aboriginal language speakers. For CBC, we are currently offering dedicated news coverage in English through CBC Indigenous, in French through Espace Autochtone, and in several Indigenous languages through CBC North. There's also platforms like CBC Gem, EC2 TV, and Audio, which all have pages dedicated to Indigenous contact. For B, increasing equitable access to jobs, leadership positions, professional development. CBC has said that they are committed to ensuring that the new policies and directives align with the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but also have a formal review of corporate policy and core operational activities. And number C there, continuing to provide dedicated news coverage and online public information. What they said is that relationships are key to the success of the strategy. That we're working on establishing reciprocal relationships with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities through meetings, partnerships, and consultation. Now I'm checking the time, and I know, Sarah, we have to end in just 1 minute. So I'm going to start a piece which is just to direct folks towards a really great report that was released this past year. It was released in April, and it's the UNESCO's report connected to Indigenous peoples and the media. I should have warned, I always come with more content than time, and now I'm looking for my specific slides
It's
here.
a good problem to have.
There we are. So this report was based upon 2 years of research and responds to the 2023 UNPFII recommendation for UNESCO to examine policies, practices, and programs related to Indigenous peoples in the media. So this included a global survey with over 308 Indigenous media organizations, 128 non-Indigenous media outlets, but also an extensive literature review. And so what they had shared here is that they fully support the implementation of Article 16 of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And very broadly, that is for Indigenous peoples to create their own media in their own languages and to access non-Indigenous media free from discrimination. It also calls upon the state to ensure that both public and private media reflect the full diversity of Indigenous peoples. And what I wanted to highlight is that it does offer 12 recommendations on how to foster more inclusive, representative, and equitable media worldwide. And generally what they said, while media attention is growing, there are some persistent challenges that remain, the main ones being stereotyping and the lack of Indigenous voices in mainstream narratives. So I do recommend, if you have that opportunity, to access the UNESCO Indigenous Peoples and the Media Report, because it has some really interesting information on key kind of messages, but also stats and those set of recommendations that media can take. Now, recognizing I'm coming to the end of my time, and we do have just a few minutes, I think, for questions, I will put up my contact information. So if you would like to ask a question directly to me or would like to get in contact with the NCTR, I will put that up on screen. But with that, maybe I'll turn to you, Sarah, and just kind of open it up to the group here if anyone has any questions.
Thank you so much, Kaila. That was informative and caring and everything one could have wished for in this. All right. Do we have any kind of public-facing questions? All right. While just in case somebody needs a bit of time to. Oh, perfect. Go for it.
Um, it's not really. What about de denialists? I don't know what the question is, but it's hard to. I don't know if you have any suggestions on how to process that. Hi, I'm
Like,
Ryan.
Do
sorry, as a reporter, sorry, no, you guys take it away.
Either way, doesn't matter.
so I do
Oh.
have a whole set of things we didn't have time for in this first part, which is residential school denialism.
Hmm.
I won't go over knowing the time that exists, but Daniel Heath Justice and Dr. Sean Carlton had released kind of two reports. One which is about the 8 most common arguments denialists use.
Hmm.
For instance, what happened in Canada is not a genocide. Residential schools were like any other boarding school. Um, those students were taught new skills to survive in life. Another one is you're forgetting that, they had good intentions. They wanted to educate. The fifth one is, well, you're talking about all the negative things. What about the good things? The sixth is connected to the fifth, which is, again, where's the equal balance? We want to make sure that voices have the exact same balance, whether they had a good or bad experience. Number seven is it was just of the times, that's just what institutions were like. And the eighth is this demand for civility. So
Hmm.
often denialists get to utilize platforms like the news to espouse misinformation, disinformation, while Indigenous peoples are told to settle down. It's not that bad, or you have such anger. Can't we have a civil conversation? And in the document, they do go over how we can address that, and what's the evidence. But what's the evidence? And I will say, coming from that background of international crimes and criminology, the arguments I hear from residential school denialists match what I hear from folks like Holocaust denialists. And often
Hmm.
it is show us the evidence, show us the human remains. And if you look at some of the individuals in the news right now, I'm trying to remember her name. I think it's Brody with the One
Yeah,
BC party. She has
yeah.
she
Victoria. She's an MP in Victoria.
so she has a sign that says zero bodies. But there's a lot of complications that go into whether or not there are human remains that are left. The main piece is human remains have been found in institutions. However, that evidence does not disquiet those denialists because often they're not interested in the facts. They
Hmm.
pick out anecdotal pieces of evidence to, twist what has been brought forward and say, well, I'm going to catch you in a loop here. You say that, there were 215 bodies, but often, that number has been adjusted. There hasn't been, extensive work for, excavation. You hear incidences where people are showing up with shovels to do their own, to do their own digging to see those human remains. And so with that, I will say residential school denialism is on the rise. If we take a look at, say, Reddit, for instance, and the amount of comments that come up, it goes up. There's actually a researcher, Mark Williamson, that we just had present to us either this week or last week about the rise of residential school denialism and public opinion connected to well, residential schools, but denialism very broadly, and some of the lessons that we can learn from that. He's connected to McGill University. I highly recommend tapping his shoulder to see if he can share that research because it's very interesting and it's something that we're looking at to utilize to really, how do we address denialism? What does that mean? And often we find that it's a very loud group. It may be a small group compared to Canadians very broadly, but they utilize that microphone and they utilize those platforms to spread that misinformation and really flood the news, flood platforms with as much misinformation as possible, making it harder for those who may not know to be able to access the correct information, which potentially could lead people down the wrong path because of all that misinformation. So the main piece is the question of how do we address this? We always revert back to we believe survivors, we listen to what they've shared about their experiences, we're fully behind them. We listen to the evidence. We have thousands of documents, federal and church-based documents that also support. I will say abusers don't create records of abuse. There's a lot of flowery language, but that's why our archive is so important to have both survivor statements, lived experiences, in combination with the, very colonial records that tell, very narrow subjective side of the story. So quite a long answer, but I don't think long enough. Rose, yes.
So I just wanted to ask about so my grandfather was a survivor of the Mohawk Institute residential school, and my dad went to Mud Lake Indian Day School, so I've always had a lot of it's been very hard for me growing up to hear people like when it comes to denialism or just being completely unaware. That was hard to see. And about kind of like keeping like you were talking about, like keeping the stories alive, keeping their names alive, keeping these, like making sure that this doesn't go, that the media doesn't forget about this or people don't forget about this. Um, I remember my first, when I was in the 11th grade, that was the first year my high school introduced, the English course was focused on Indigenous history and talking, like informing about residential school. And that was the first year they ever did something like that. I'd never seen that in school before, or them ever acknowledge like anything about Indigenous history. So I don't know if that is improving still in high schools, but do you think that that's a step forward that they're introducing like programs and courses like that in high schools?
100%. And actually, that's why I also really appreciated Mark's presentation as he shared that in kind of the survey work that they were doing, those who disagreed the most against, denialism or denialist arguments were those who had attended university, who may have known someone who's Indigenous, or had Indigenous course content in their primary education. So the increase of history-based pieces of residential schools, federal day schools, segregated healthcare, once it enters into that public education system, the greater the likelihood that someone is going to push back against the denialist, arguments because they have the information. They now, it was given in a form or a means for folks to access. And so, there are some areas or some regions in Canada that have greater inclusion of Indigenous history, residential school history, and other areas that are still kind of struggling with that. One kind of area that is of concern, and it also kind of connects back to Cindy Blackstock's comment, is a little bit of a walking back of reconciliation efforts. That is, they may have started that work down the path to include history and curriculum, but if we turn to Alberta, for instance, they had done work to revamp their curriculum, and unfortunately, they had removed all references to residential schools until grade 5. And so I believe there were the signatories of either, well, I'm going to get it confused. It was between Treaty 6 and 8. But the signatories within that region had submitted public letters that stated that, this is an affront to all the work that's been done to date in order to address reconciliation in this history and legacy. It should not be removed. And so I haven't had the opportunity to check in to see what's the progress to date on that curriculum redevelopment. Oh, Ryan, did you have a...
Well, yeah, I'm from Alberta, born and raised. I'll be going back next week for Christmas, and my best friend, well, she's a teacher, and her mother was very up in the Edmonton School Board. And I always check in with the public's fucking school board and what's happening in Alberta this year because it's always something. And yeah. I will ask her about that. Yeah, Daniel Smith, they spent 3 years revamping the whole curriculum about 4 years ago, and then Daniel Smith just said, nope, gone, and then just cut it all. It's crazy.
And we saw something somewhat similar right before Doug Ford took office in Ontario.
Yeah, that's
The
right.
Ontario province had been working very hard on addressing curriculum, and they were working with Indigenous nations and educators to increase that inclusion. And once he entered to the office, the project was cut and those changes weren't made.
And it was like at
So
the end of the process too. Like it was, oh,
it was actually very near completion and ready to be launched. So it was unfortunate in that case to see all that work go kind of to the lay side. And so that's one of the main concerns that we have when it comes to, changes in government, because each government cycle, I suppose, will have different priorities. And the current priorities right now are really kind of coming at odds with some of those principles and ideas behind truth and reconciliation, consultation, ensuring that communities have that voice when it comes to projects, I suppose, when it comes to resource extraction, as an example, and what the duty is of the government to ensure that they fulfill all those obligations before starting a project or entering the project, and what that might mean. And so I'd say there's the shift in priorities can sometimes be a challenge. One such area is, we saw a little bit of a cut in funding when it comes to work around missing children and unmarked burials. We saw a cut in funding connected to our records-based work. So we're waiting on about 23 million new records to come in from the federal government, 6 million pages from the federal day school system, but that's currently on hiatus, and I don't have an ETA to say when those records would come in because of that cut in funding. So one of for me, I'd say the most detrimental pieces I've seen with other settlement agreements is, although they did bring in funds and focus on intergenerational healing, culture and language revitalization, all very important, no other settlement agreement has included a truth commission like the one for residential schools. So I don't have as much information to share with audiences about these other colonial systems because that information isn't being collected. And I do worry and am concerned about the potential loss of that information and that loss of that history component when that's not being collected, or I should say pulled together. I do hope in the long run that we will be a repository to hold those other records. But of course, that priority first is connected to schools within the settlement agreement. And then I will say there are over 1,500 institutions that were put forward. So we have to then also think about provincially or territorially run residential-based schools, convent-based schools, church-only run residential schools. So those survivors who suffered the same harms and abuses, but aren't formally recognized, haven't received an apology, haven't received compensation because they don't have a class action. There are some that are kind of currently in progress, and I do hope that it will set a precedent to allow for those individuals and families impacted to see it come full circle and receive that acknowledgement, that apology, that compensation. But it's hard to say. We don't know what we don't know when it comes to the future.
Definitely. Thank you. I'm just going to see if anybody who isn't a fellow has any questions. I suspect not. And if it's all right, we'll leave it there. Okay. All right. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining today. Thank you so much, Kaila, for being here with us. It's been really, really special, but like moving. Thank you. We have one more in this series next week. If anybody is interested in joining, please keep an eye on the JHR and IJA social media accounts. If you have any feedback, please send it to canadian.programs@jhr.ca. Again, that's canadian.programs@jhr.ca.